On the afternoon of June 28, 1778, the Continental Army tried something difficult in brutal heat. Near Monmouth Courthouse, units that had been marching and fighting for hours had to turn, dress their ranks, and occupy a new line while British troops pressed forward. What had made that recovery more likely? The Americans did not move like machines, and the battle did not become a clean triumph. Yet battalions recovered from disorder instead of simply dissolving. Officers could issue familiar commands, soldiers could recognize them, and separate formations could cooperate under pressure. The most important change was not courage. It was a shared military language. That moment offers a better way to understand Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben than the familiar story of a Prussian genius rescuing a helpless mob. The Continental Army had already survived hard campaigns, mounted complex operations, and fought disciplined opponents. What it lacked was consistency across regiments raised by different states and trained by different officers. Steuben did not invent American bravery, the bayonet, or the non-commissioned officer. His achievement was to organize existing experience into repeatable methods. The real question is therefore narrower and more revealing. How much can standardization change an army that already knows how to fight? 4 months earlier, Valley Forge looked less like a school than a crowded military city under construction. Washington's army entered the Pennsylvania encampment on December 19, 1777, after losing Philadelphia to the British. More than 12,000 soldiers arrived, accompanied by hundreds of women and children who worked within the camp community. The troops built roughly 1,500 log huts and miles of defensive works. Supply shortages left many men without serviceable shoes, coats, or blankets. Those hardships were severe, but the famous picture of an army continuously buried in snow is misleading. The winter itself was not exceptionally cold by regional standards. The more persistent dangers were weak supply systems, poor shelter at the beginning of the encampment, contaminated surroundings, and infectious disease. Early in March, returns listed thousands temporarily unfit because they lacked clothing. Nearly 2,000 people died during the encampment, with disease taking most lives and the greatest mortality arriving in spring. Hunger reduced resistance to illness, but the surviving evidence does not support claims that soldiers starved to death in camp. Valley Forge was a crisis of administration and health as much as weather. The Army's organizational problem was visible in daily movement. Regiments followed manuals or habits brought by their own commanders. A command understood in one brigade might be expressed differently in another. Steps, formations, inspections, and loading procedures could vary. That mattered whenever units had to combine, replace losses, or maneuver beside strangers. A battlefield order passed through several levels of command, and every translation created room for delay. Washington needed more than a collection of capable regiments. He needed a system that would let those regiments function as parts of the same institution. It is equally important to say what the Continentals were not. They were not raw civilians who had never faced regular troops. Veterans at Valley Forge had fought from Long Island to Trenton, Princeton, Brandywine, and Germantown. They had conducted night marches, crossed rivers, attacked fortified positions, and sometimes stood under punishing fire. Their officers had learned through costly experience, while artillerymen and engineers already practiced specialized skills. Any account that makes Steuben the source of all military competence erases 3 years of adaptation. He entered an army with knowledge, resilience, and serious weaknesses, not an empty classroom. Steuben brought a different kind of experience. Born in Prussia in 1730, he grew up around military life and served during the 7 Years' War. He became a captain, worked in staff assignments, and encountered the demanding administrative culture associated with Frederick the Great's forces. His record was respectable, but later introductions exaggerated it. He had not been a Prussian lieutenant general, and he had not commanded vast armies in battle. What he possessed was practical familiarity with drilling troops, managing units, and turning abstract regulations into routines that could be observed and corrected. Peace left him without the career he wanted. After leaving Prussian service, Steuben worked for a small German principality and used the title of Baron, although the grandeur later attached to that title exceeded his circumstances. By the mid-1770s, he was searching for another appointment. The American Rebellion created an opportunity, but Congress had grown wary of European officers who arrived expecting high rank and immediate pay. Steuben's prospects depended on presenting valuable expertise without appearing to demand command over officers who had already endured the war. In France, intermediaries connected him with the American commissioners Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane. A recommendation sent ahead described him in terms more impressive than the facts justified, elevating his former rank and associating him closely with Frederick's command. The inflation was real, but it was not the whole explanation for his success. Steuben also agreed to serve first as a volunteer, asking that Congress judge his value before settling compensation. That offer reduced the political risk. It allowed American leaders to test an unfamiliar officer rather than surrender authority on the strength of a European title. He crossed the Atlantic with a small household of aides and reached Portsmouth, New Hampshire, late in 1777. Traveling south, he met Congress at York, Pennsylvania, in February. His formal letters were respectful and carefully framed. He offered service to the American cause and did not initially insist on a paid commission. Washington accepted the experiment. On February 23, 1778, Steuben arrived at Valley Forge, where the commander-in-chief could observe both his technical ability and his judgment around American officers. The newcomer faced an immediate communication problem. His English was limited, and the army could not be instructed in German. Aides and bilingual officers helped convert his explanations through French and English, sometimes refining a lesson before it reached the ranks. Later recollections emphasized his temper and his inventive multilingual swearing, stories that made excellent folklore. More consequential was his willingness to step into the training area. European inspectors often issued instructions through layers of subordinates. Steuben demonstrated movements himself, corrected individuals, and made the intended result visible even when vocabulary failed. Instead of attempting to drill every soldier at once, he began with a small model company drawn from several units. Sources disagree about its exact size, which is a reason to avoid false precision, but its purpose is clear. The selected soldiers practiced under close supervision, where other officers could watch. Once the group performed a movement consistently, its members and observers carried the method back to their regiments. The company was therefore less a ceremonial guard than a working prototype, a limited sample through which one procedure could be tested, corrected, and distributed. This was an early form of training the trainers. Steuben first taught a manageable group, then relied on officers and non-commissioned officers to reproduce the lesson. The approach solved a problem of scale. One inspector could not personally coach thousands of people every morning, but he could establish a standard, prepare instructors, and use inspections to see whether the standards survived. It also respected the Army's existing chain of command. Regimental leaders remained responsible for their soldiers. The inspector gave those leaders a common framework by which performance could be compared. The first lessons addressed basic movement because complicated maneuvers depend on ordinary steps. Soldiers practiced how to stand, face a line, wheel, and change formation without losing the men on either side. Cadence mattered, but Steuben adapted European practice to American conditions rather than copying a Prussian parade ground in full. His system sought shorter commands and useful battlefield control. The point of dressing a line was not visual perfection. It was to keep a unit from opening dangerous gaps, masking another unit's fire, or becoming a crowd when terrain forced a change of direction. Weapons drill received the same treatment. Continental soldiers carried a mixture of French and British pattern flintlock muskets, and loading under stress required a sequence that protected both speed and safety. The manual Steuben later prepared reduced the process to a common set of motions and commands. A trained soldier still had to bite or open a cartridge, charge the barrel, ram the load, prime the lock when required, shoulder the weapon, and fire under orders. Standard words allowed officers to control when hundreds of individual actions began and ended. They could not make a musket accurate, but they could make collective fire manageable. Bayonet training acquired a dramatic reputation because many Americans had previously lacked either the weapon or confidence in using it. Yet the socket bayonet was already standard military technology, not Steuben's invention. His contribution was to place it within repeated instruction, fixing it correctly, keeping formation, advancing without tangling weapons, and treating it as a practical tool rather than an ornament. The psychological effect mattered. Troops who expected to hold close ground needed confidence that they could continue after firing. Still, later success with bayonets depended on selected troops, planning, surprise, terrain, and leadership as well as drill. Steuben also learned from the soldiers before him. American units did not possess unlimited manpower for elaborate European formations, and wooded or broken terrain punished rigid prescriptions. He simplified some movements and focused on procedures that commanders could actually use. This flexibility helps explain why his program spread. He demanded discipline, but he did not assume that an American private should be treated as a voiceless machine. Officers were expected to explain, supervise, and share hardship. That relationship differed from caricatures of Prussian service and fitted an army whose soldiers understood themselves as citizens serving under contract. Training was only one part of the inspector's work. Steuben examined returns, equipment, formations, and the condition of units. Inspection made problems visible beyond a single regiment. If ammunition boxes were incomplete, weapons neglected, or companies inaccurately reported, higher command needed a dependable way to discover it. Standard forms and recurring checks could never eliminate shortages, but they reduced the ability of confusion to hide them. An army operating across several states required comparable information. In that sense, the Inspector General's office was a communications system as much as a school for marching. Camp organization offered another field for reform. Waste, animal remains, kitchens, drainage, and latrines could turn a crowded encampment into a disease engine when placed carelessly. Steuben promoted ordered streets and clearer separation between cooking areas, refuse sites, and sanitary facilities. He did not create modern germ theory, and hygiene improvements alone did not stop the epidemics at Valley Forge. Smallpox inoculation, medical care, supply, shelter, and seasonal disease patterns all mattered. But relocating filth and making officers responsible for cleanliness addressed dangers that soldiers could observe, even if they did not understand microbes. The role of non-commissioned officers became more explicit within this system. Sergeants and corporals had existed in the Continental Army from its beginning. Steuben did not conjure an NCO corps out of nothing. He clarified duties that made those ranks essential: maintaining order within a company, supervising details, forming men for duty, reporting absences, and helping recruits master the drill. Officers could set intent, but daily standards survived through people close enough to notice a loose flint, a missing cartridge box, or a soldier who did not understand the next movement. As spring advanced, the model spread outward. A lesson demonstrated at the center of camp returned through brigades in the hands of local instructors. The process was not instant, universal, or frictionless. Men were detached for guard, construction, foraging, and other duties. Illness interrupted companies. Equipment remained uneven, and commanders differed in enthusiasm. Nevertheless, repetition created compatibility. A soldier transferred from one formation to another was increasingly likely to hear commands he recognized. The army was becoming easier to combine, which was precisely the advantage Washington needed before the next campaign. Steuben's official position caught up with his practical role in early May. Congress appointed him Inspector General with the rank and pay of a Major General on May 5, 1778. The commission rewarded work already underway. It did not transform a mysterious volunteer overnight. The following day, the army celebrated the new French alliance with a grand feu de joie, a sequential discharge that passed through the assembled ranks. Such a display was ceremonial, but it demanded timing and coordination. It allowed commanders and visitors to see thousands of separate soldiers participate in one planned action. The celebration should not be mistaken for proof that every battlefield problem had been solved. A parade occurs on prepared ground, under expected commands, without an enemy trying to break the formation. Even so, it showed that standard practice had become visible across the encampment. The alliance itself also changed the strategic picture by promising French military and financial support. Steuben's work belonged inside that broader recovery. Improved supply under Nathaniel Greene, engineering, artillery preparation, inoculation, recruitment, and international aid all helped make the army that emerged from Valley Forge stronger than the one that arrived. On June 19, 1778, the Continentals marched out of Valley Forge. Their departure came because the British had evacuated Philadelphia and were moving across New Jersey toward New York, not because the encampment had reached a ceremonial graduation date. Washington followed with a force enlarged by returning troops and reinforcements. The army carried persistent weaknesses with it, but it also carried shared drill, a functioning inspection system, and commanders who had spent months working together. The next test would occur during movement, in heat, against an experienced opponent. The British evacuation created both an opportunity and a risk. Their column included combat troops, baggage, and loyalist civilians moving toward the security of New York. American leaders debated how aggressively to attack. Washington sent an advanced force of Charles Lee to strike near Monmouth Courthouse while the main army followed. On June 28, Lee's mixed detachment encountered a confusing battlefield and stronger resistance than expected. Units advanced on different routes, orders became unclear, and portions of the force began withdrawing. Standard drill had not abolished uncertainty or disagreement at command level. Washington met the retreat on the road and reorganized the defense. American units occupied successive positions while artillery supported the line. This phase is often turned into a simple morality play in which one commander failed and another, armed with Steuben's training, instantly restored order. Reality was more complicated. Experienced officers and soldiers drew on several years of warfare, the terrain offered useful positions, and British troops had endured their own exhausting march. The value of a common system appeared not as magic, but as reduced friction while formations were redirected under extreme pressure. Steuben was present at Monmouth and assisted with organizing troops, but he did not personally command every successful movement. Nor can every wheel, volley or bayonet be credited to a few months of instruction. What the training supplied was a baseline. When a battalion received an order to form, advance or change front, its members shared more assumptions about how to execute it. Officers from different states had a more consistent vocabulary. That advantage could preserve time at a moment when delay exposed a flank or left artillery unsupported. The fighting continued through a day remembered for oppressive heat. British assaults failed to destroy Washington's main position, and the Americans remained on the field when darkness approached. During the night, the British resumed their movement toward New York. The tactical result was inconclusive rather than the sweeping American victory sometimes claimed. Official campaign summaries list 69 Americans killed, 161 wounded and 130 missing. British returns listed 65 killed, 155 wounded and 64 missing, although heat casualties and later accounting complicate any neat comparison. Monmouth demonstrated that the Continental Army could maneuver and hold ground against British regulars in a large conventional engagement. It did not prove that the army had been worthless before Valley Forge, or that drill alone decided battles. Artillery, leadership, endurance, terrain, and the British strategic withdrawal all shaped the outcome. The fairest conclusion is also the most useful. Standardization raised the reliability of actions that soldiers already knew in some form. It made performance less dependent on which regiment happened to receive an order. Steuben next tried to preserve that reliability beyond his personal presence. During and after Valley Forge, he developed written rules governing military discipline and unit organization. Congress approved publication in March of 1779, and the first printing produced 1,500 copies. Bound in blue paper covers, the book acquired the enduring nickname Blue Book. Its appearance was modest. Its ambition was institutional. A commander in a distant camp could consult the same instructions as a regiment near headquarters. The regulations covered more than parade ground motions. They described the soldier's position under arms, loading and firing, marching, wheeling, forming columns, changing fronts, and handling guards. They also assigned responsibilities to officers and non-commissioned officers, outlined camp arrangements, and addressed inspections and discipline. Diagrams helped translate movement into visible geometry. The text did not emerge from one isolated author writing in perfect English. Steuben worked through translation and editorial assistance, while American experience shaped the final form. The result was a practical hybrid rather than a copied Prussian code. No manual can guarantee behavior in mud, smoke, darkness, or fear. Regulations are most effective when leaders train from them, correct errors, and adapt them without destroying their common meaning. Some of Steuben's provisions reflected the 18th century and eventually became obsolete. For decades, however, the Blue Book gave the United States Army a central reference and remained influential through the War of 1812. Its longevity reveals the deeper success of Valley Forge. Temporary lessons became an object that could travel, be reprinted, and outlive the original instructor. The bayonet assault on Stony Point in July of 1779 provided a later, sharper example of disciplined preparation. American light infantry approached a fortified British position on a rocky peninsula beside the Hudson River. Assault columns carried unloaded muskets with fixed bayonets, reducing the chance that an accidental shot would destroy surprise. They crossed difficult approaches and captured the works in roughly 25 minutes, taking nearly 500 prisoners and 15 artillery pieces. Steuben's system helped establish common fundamentals, but the operation also depended on Anthony Wayne's planning, reconnaissance, selected troops, darkness, and tightly controlled objectives. As the war shifted south, Steuben's assignment changed again. He went to Virginia, where the immediate problems included recruiting, equipping, organizing, and forwarding troops to active commands. These tasks were less picturesque than a drill demonstration and often more frustrating. State authority, shortages, expiring enlistments, and enemy operations limited what an inspector could accomplish. His disputes with civilian and military officials show that standardized expectations did not erase politics. Yet the work of assembling usable formations from scattered resources was a continuation of the same institutional project he had begun at Valley Forge. In 1781, Steuben served in Virginia while British forces campaigned through the state. He helped defend stores and organize resistance, then joined the converging American and French forces at Yorktown. There he commanded a division during the siege. Victory resulted from cooperation on a scale no individual reformer could claim. Washington's Continentals, French troops under Rochambeau, French naval power, siege artillery, engineers, militia, logistics, and British strategic isolation. Steuben belonged to that coalition as an experienced American general, no longer an untested European volunteer. After the peace, he assisted with demobilization and continued to argue for professional military standards. Washington's farewell correspondence praised his faithful service, a judgment grounded in years of work rather than the inflated recommendation that had opened the door. Steuben also participated in the Society of the Cincinnati, an organization formed by Continental officers to preserve fellowship and memory. The Republic, however, remained suspicious of a large permanent army. His institutional influence would therefore survive less through a massive peacetime force than through regulations, trained veterans, and expectations about responsibility within the chain of command. The United States did not reward him quickly or simply. Congress and the states debated compensation, while Steuben struggled with expenses and debt. New York eventually granted him 16,000 acres, and the federal government provided an annual pension. He settled on his property in the Mohawk Valley with members of the household that had supported him during the war. He died on November 28, 1794, and was buried on the land. The modest setting contrasts with the heroic monuments later raised in his name. Those monuments often present Steuben as the man who transformed farmers into soldiers. The phrase is memorable and incomplete. Many Continentals were artisans, laborers, sailors, immigrants, free black men, native men, and experienced veterans as well as farmers. They had already created an army capable of surviving defeats and winning operations. What Steuben gave them was not identity or courage. He helped make their varied experience portable across organizational boundaries. That achievement is less romantic than a lone savior story, but it explains more about how institutions improve. His importance also rests on a principle larger than any single drill. Armies learn when knowledge moves from individuals into routines, teaching networks, records, and accountable roles. The model company demonstrated a method. Brigade instructors multiplied it, inspectors measured it, non-commissioned officers sustained it, the Blue Book stored it. Each layer reduced dependence on one charismatic expert. If Steuben had only impressed Washington with a brilliant parade, his influence might have ended with the campaign. Because the system could reproduce itself, parts of it remained after the people at Valley Forge were gone. So what changed between the huts in Pennsylvania and the line at Monmouth? Not human nature and not the entire character of the Continental Army. Soldiers still became exhausted, officers still misunderstood one another, weapons still misfired, and campaigns still turned on supply and strategy. The change was the probability of coordinated action. More units could receive an order and begin from the same mental template. In war, small reductions in confusion accumulate. They create minutes to form a line, space to support a gun, and confidence that a neighboring regiment will move in a recognizable way. Von Steuben deserves a central place in the story of the American Revolution precisely because the evidence does not require a myth. He arrived with useful experience, questionable credentials, political tact, and an unusual ability to teach. He worked inside an army that was already resilient and helped it become more coherent. Valley Forge was not a frozen resurrection performed by one foreign officer. It was a season in which many reforms, sacrifices, and alliances converged. Steuben's durable contribution was to turn shared practice into institutional memory, and to show that an army becomes stronger when its knowledge no longer belongs to only one regiment or one man.